In addition to the basic fundamental principles of art, the four basic shape, I want to introduce you to an interview that was taken by an organization called Voca, V-O-C-A, and it was interviewed by Jonathan Allen, who is one of the member committee that was interviewing a extinguished artist named Otto Neal from the Dorsey Art Gallery here in Brooklyn on Roger Avenue. So what I'm doing is getting the word out for my good artists, because I'm affiliated with the Dorsey Art Gallery, and this person have been drawing and painting and sculpture for like many years. I mean, he's very well known, and what he's doing now is having his biography done with this organization, and I think this is very, very excellent.
I am here with Otto Neals, painter, sculptor, printmaker, and draftsman. You've lived in New York since 1935. We're sitting here in your home that you've called home for the last 40 years. Your career is impressive and wide-ranging and inspiring. You've held leadership roles at some of the most important artist collectives and galleries that support Black artists in both Harlem and Brooklyn over the last decades. You have public commissions spread over multiple boroughs and many respected venues, and your work is held in many public and private collections. In 2015, you were the subject of a 5-venue retrospective that focused on 50 years of your creative output. It's a delight to be speaking with you here today, Otto.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. Thank you so much.
When did you start making art?
My first recollection is when we came to New York, and we came and we stayed with relatives, and I recall drawing during that time, around 1935 or so.
And were they supportive of you as an artist?
Well, at that early age, yes, they were supportive. And as I grew older, and if I can recall around 13 or so, my parents bought me an oil painting set. And I got into oil painting.
Wow.
And I worked and drew.
So you studied at George Westinghouse High School?
Yes.
And what did you study there?
Well, at the time, it was called Brooklyn High School for Specialty Trades. When I entered, that George Westinghouse was called. And they had a course, what they call commercial art. But to me, it was more or less a sign painting course, because that was the focus was on sign painting, and there was very little what would be called commercial art. But I'm happy, because learning sign painting helped me later on as I went on in life.
And how did it help you?
Well, I started working mainly at in the post office. I was a clerk, and I found out later on that there was a section where they did art.
Hmm.
It was called sign painting and illustrating, and I wound up getting into that section as a result of my sign painting background.
So it was perfectly suited in a way, your background.
Oh
at the
yeah,
high
it worked
school.
out nicely.
And then you also, I understand, studied at Brooklyn Museum School of Art.
Well, it was just a brief workshop there. I studied with Isaac Sawyer for a couple of months, and it was a very, very loose program. There was no real instruction. They set up models, and you painted, the models, and Isaac Sawyer would come around and just look at your work and grunt, or and walk on. But there was no real instruction.
So it was independently.
Yeah, each person did their own thing.
Okay.
Yes.
Aside from sign painting and that course at the Brooklyn Museum, what other was there any other formal education that you pursued, or?
The only thing I actually studied was at the printmaking workshop. Etching and lithography.
Okay.
But I'm basically self-taught in all the other areas. But again, through the aid of books, I did have help in that direction.
Hmm.
But everything else came from me
Hmm.
or through me.
And I just wanted to touch on the post office a bit more. You became the head illustrator there.
Well, that was after a number of years. I was a sign painter,
Mm-hmm.
and then I became an illustrator, and eventually the head illustrator before I retired.
Okay. And how did having the stability of that full-time job affect your studio practice?
I don't think it had very much, effect. Although I was able to create, small sketches and whatnot for ideas that may pop in my head while I'm working, and so, I had the paints there and pads and whatnot. I would make small sketches of what I plan to do, while I'm at work.
And I understand your first studio was near the post office. It was in downtown Brooklyn.
Yes, I had a studio at 60 Hanson Place, right, not too far from the Williamsburg Savings Bank, about 2 blocks away. And that was my first real studio.
So, can you tell us a bit about Vivian Schuyler Key?
Vivian Schuyler Key was a wonderful person, born in Hempstead, New York. She used to travel from Hempstead to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. She was a painter and sculptor. And back in the 20s, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois commissioned her to do covers for the Crisis magazine.
Mm.
And I understand that she did at least 6 covers for the Crisis magazine.
She was the first African American woman to graduate from Pratt Institute
That's what I hear, yes.
and a renowned leader in the Harlem Renaissance. You've characterized her as a mentor.
Yes.
How did you guys meet?
Well, we met back, I think, in 1958, which was the founding date of the Fulton Art Fair. She was a participant, and so was I. And that was when I first met her. And we became, friends, and later on, she's the one that invited me to share this space at 60 Hanson Place.
What was downtown Brooklyn like then?
It was lively, back then, much more so than it is now. Now it's the structures going up, the tall buildings going up, but there I think it was more people coming together, in terms of sharing ideas, art, and so on.
And how did her mentorship and friendship affect your work?
Well, I began to pay more attention to my work. And she didn't like abstract work, and she would rail against some of the things, and so paid more attention to what I was doing. Before I was just doing it, but with her help, I, began to look at the pieces, I guess with a more critical eye.
And why didn't you like abstraction?
I have no idea. Maybe the schooling that she got at Pratt during those days.
Okay.
Yes.
And I understand Curiosity was made at that studio on Hanson Place.
Yes. Curiosity came about, and I had no idea of ever producing any work in stone, although Mrs. Key and I used to talk about carving in stone, when we would have lunch during our breaks. We would talk about stone carving. And, for months, I don't know, maybe years went by, and we would talk about, carving in stone. And one day, I walked into my studio, and I saw laying on a table a set of carving tools. And I thought Mrs. Key was, showing off, that she was going to get into, stone carving. And I, approached her, and she said, no, those tools are for you. And I said, oh. And so they were there for probably a couple of weeks or so, and I began to figure out, what am I going to do now, And I came across a piece of stone up in Harlem, not too far from the gallery that some friends and I ran. And I saw this stone lying on the sidewalk, probably a piece from an abandoned building. And one day I brought a file and I tested it and found that it was beautiful white stone. And when I got transportation, I brought it back to my space and that began to carve. And the idea for Curiosity came about, and I just went into it.
And that was your first stone sculpture?
Yes.
Before then, what were you working in? What materials were you?
Well, I would carve in wood, besides the painting in oils.
Okay.
Watercolor was very foreign to me. I ran away from watercolor because it was very difficult, but it was mainly oil painting and drawing, oil painting, and wood sculpture.
How do you source materials, or how do you, where do you find the materials you work with?
Well, on occasions I buy, some materials, but most of the time I'm on the lookout for abandoned buildings, where they would tear, I would look and see if it's stone that's usable, preferably marble, because marble is a beautiful working tool, material. And I've acquired quite a bit of stone that way. On a few occasions, I bought stone. In fact, I have in my yard 2 or 3 pieces of stone I bought way back in the 80s, I think, even the 70s or 80s. And this sculptor I know, he would travel to Italy and Spain and whatnot, purchasing marble. And I bought a couple of $1,000s worth of marble, 2 pieces sitting in my yard now. But one of the pieces I carved from that is in the collection of the Schomburg Library, a piece I call Pride. And that was carved from a piece that was probably about 600 pounds. And I had to chip off about 250, 300 pounds.
Oh my.
And I was pleased with the piece, too. That was carved in my backyard.
So when did you move here? When did you set up your studio in the backyard and downstairs?
I moved here in 1976. It's about 40 years ago. And at that time, I had the studio downtown. So when Atlantic Terminal came in, when they began to tear down the buildings for the Atlantic Terminal, I moved all of the things from the Hanson Place studio here. And my garage, which I used to use for stone carving and large wood carving, that is now cluttered with pieces of wood, stone, frames, paintings, and so on. The garage is cluttered. And my basement, which was like a studio, a gallery rather, that is now covered with my work. and nothing but my work is on the walls there now. I use my studio basement now. It's not as convenient, even though I'm here and at home. The studio at Hanson Place was much more suitable, I think.
More spacious.
More spacious, yes. More comfortable working there than here.
Did you, before we leave the Hanson Place studio, what visitors did you and Vivian have come by? Who came by? And saw your work?
John Roden, the well-known sculptor, who did the piece at Harlem Hospital, and also the piece at a large abstract piece at Bellevue Hospital. He did a 12-foot statue of Frederick Douglass at Lincoln University. He was one of the persons that would come by, visit, and give me pointers every now and then. In fact, he assisted me on trying to break up a piece of stone that was unworkable, but he tried to help me work with it, But he was a visitor, and a few other people,
When did you meet Emmett Wigglesworth?
Emmett Wigglesworth I met more than 50 years ago. He came in from Philadelphia, and he was friends with a friend of mine who also came from Philadelphia, Carl Wright. And we, hooked up, and I found Emmett to be a wonderful person, doing wonderful works of art. And we began to show together a few places.
When we walked on our tour, looking at your works in different public collections, in several locations we also saw Emmett's work. Did having artistic peers and colleagues influence your process?
Oh yeah, I think the coming in contact with some of the artists, pointed me in different directions, like learning printmaking, for instance, wood carving. I think I might not have gotten into that had I not been introduced to artists that were doing that type of work.
I wanted to, from there, a perfect segue, dive into your work. As I mentioned before, you've worked across many media over several decades. There's often a figurative component to your work, so I wanted to start there and just hear a bit more about why so much of your work is figurative.
Well, I feel more comfortable doing that. In fact, I find working in abstract very, very difficult. I tried a few pieces. In fact, I was invited to take part in an abstract show, which I think it started at the Pratt Institute. I was in a show there, and I showed about half a dozen pieces, abstract work I created. And from that, I had another one-man show at the Brooklyn Gas Company, downtown Flatbush Avenue. I had a one-man show of just abstract works. And I don't consider myself an abstract painter, but I produce these pieces, abstract pieces, which I mentioned I found to be very, very difficult to do. I feel more comfortable doing the figurative works.
Well, it's interesting because your figurative works do simplify and abstract certain details and visual information. So it's interesting that you wouldn't be as comfortable like working purely abstractly.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I do, sort of stylized works, where I take the figurative form and accent certain parts, and but I have to. It seems I feel like I said, the sticking with the abstract, the figurative form, suits me better.
And how do you think your approach to the figure has shifted? If we looked at an Otto Neals from 1975 and looked at an Otto Neals from 1995, how has it changed for you?
Well, I think I did some stylization of some of the works, and some of it I think came about as a result of meeting and seeing some of the works of Jacob Lawrence. because I think I took some of my figurative forms and sort of stylized them as a result of seeing Jake's work.
Hmm.
Yeah, so there's a piece I think it was published in Ebony magazine back in 1971. It was a piece I did called A Prophet,
Hmm.
and that is a direct result of my contact with Jake Lawrence. Where I took the form and sort of stylized it, made it sort of flat forms.
And does that stylization come from specific models, or are you looking at figures or photographs or source material, or is it more imaginative?
I think it came from both the imagination and sometimes things I see. I might see an image of a form of or a person or whatever, and I can visualize it in being sort of stylized or abstracted.
And where does printmaking fall for you?
Well, printmaking, it took a while before I got into it. It was Kay Brown who introduced me to Bob Blackburn in the printmaking workshop. And there I got into etching. And, I found that, it was a form I liked. But prior to that, I had done some woodcuts. And, that was a form I liked also.
Hmm.
But the printmaking workshop introduced me to etching and lithography. I find lithography it's a bit more challenging. I found some difficulties when I was working it, so I lean more towards the etching and some other things that came about from the etching. I learned this from Krishna Reddy, a form of printmaking where it's called viscosity printing, and I enjoyed that form very much.
You mentioned painting, that you started oil painting, you received your first oil painting set at a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
Where does painting exist for you in your creative process?
Well, I'm still painting. I'm not using oil as much as I did in the past. I'm doing a lot of acrylic pieces, and this is with the stylized forms, flat forms and so on. And that's and I feel comfortable using acrylics because it's quick drying and so on. I could do the same things I'm doing now in oil, but it doesn't pay. It takes much longer.
So before sculpture, you were principally, would you like if I had run into you at an opening in the 60s, would you have described yourself as a painter?
Probably a painter in
Okay.
the 60s, and I got more and more into sculpture as time went by. In the late 60s and early 70s, I got into wood, more into wood, and then very early into the stone.
Okay.
And then even later on, I got into modeling. I didn't do too much clay work,
Okay.
but the modeling with clay and then the bronzes came later on.
And throughout all of this, what binds it visually together? Do you have sketchbooks, or do you keep drawings of upcoming projects and old projects, or is drawing a foundational activity?
Well, it's incidental. I sometimes just grab a scrap of paper when I have an idea. I make a drawing on a scrap of paper, and which quickly disappears somewhere, And I have a few scrapbooks, but most of my work is not recorded that way,
With your work across different media, a word that often comes up when I read about you or research you is your versatility, which I brought up earlier. Where do the different media that you work in, where are you in them, or do you feel closer to one, or do you feel that each one is speaking to a different set of questions you have?
Well, when I'm asked that question, I always say I feel more comfortable working in whatever I happen to be working in. If it's stone, I'm happy. If it's acrylic, I'm happy. If it's watercolors, I'm happy. You know, whatever I happen to be, that is what I prefer. Whatever, you know, I happen to be working with, that is what I prefer. You know, I don't have a preference. You know, they all appeal to me. Whatever you know.
And do you feel that they speak to one another within the studio practice? And by that I mean, do you have a sculpture you're working on and you're also working on a series of paintings? So there's a relationship or dialogue that happens between media?
You know, I find that I generally hop from one to the other. You know, and that there's generally no connection between the two.
I wanted to talk about, we've talked about different media, different traditional approaches to media, sculpture, printmaking, drawing. But when I'm in your studio, I also see drums, I see instruments, the beautiful statuette you designed for the New Federal Theater, walking sticks. There seems to be a real creative inquiry that gets beyond these boundaries of media that many artists work within. Can you speak to that idiosyncrasy or?
You know, I'm not too sure of how these things happen. You know, I may wake up one morning and boom, I see you know an image and I just get into it. I don't know how these things happen. They just it comes about. You know, and you know I don't have a plan.
Yeah,
You know, it seems that many of these things come from without.
yeah.
I don't have a hand in its planning. You know, it just happens. I may conceive of something. Like I mentioned that some years ago, I found this limb in the street. And I took it home, put it in my hall, and it stayed there for about maybe a year. And one day I opened up the door, and I saw exactly what it was to become. So that's how things happen. You know, I have no idea of of how these things. You know, it seems to be sort of mystical. You know, the ideas just pop up. You know, without me having a hand in its planning. You know, so you know a lot of work happens that way. There's things happening beyond me. I'm more or less a vehicle. Something else is controlling me. You know, I don't feel that I'm really in control.
I wanted to read a quote from you and then just expand on this a little more.